with the city budget overview while we're waiting on some of our presenters. So of note for the second district, we've gotten Fox has 15 million in it just to make sure if there's any shortfall with the insurance money or the historic tax credits don't work out, that we will be able to cover that. So that is good news. And on cue, School Board Member Mariah White, welcome. I was just welcoming everyone and starting to get into the budget, but if you would like to bring greetings and update from RPS, welcome your comments. Is Mariah unmuted? Mariah, can you hear us?
Ms. White, I just prompted you to unmute if you're able to.
Okay, we will. Here we go.
Good evening. Good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Yes. Hi, Mariah.
Hi, how are you all today? Good evening. Sorry for my lateness. Just getting off work. Yes, RPS, I did hear you, but I didn't know I was muted. Coming from RPS, I'm gonna give some updates. I'm gonna also send this out to Catherine so she can put it also on her newsletter for Friday. We're gonna start at Fox. As everyone knows, Fox Playground is closed tomorrow. We are up and running. We're starting the roof. So the roof is starting to go on and the playground will be closed. So that's one thing I wanted to let you know in advance. Also, summer school will be held at Fox for Mumford, Mary Mumford, J.B. Carey, and Carver. We will have 4 schools there this year for summer school, starting June the 20th through July the 20th. And that time will be Monday through Thursday, 8 a.m. to 2:30. As you know, the Strawberry Festival is March 13th, a Saturday, 12 to 4. We also, the next thing is Teachers Appreciation Day. Want everyone to know that. I spoke with Ms. Jacobs, and if anyone would like to donate anything for Teachers Appreciation Day, she's asking for May the 11th. So bring whatever you want to honor our teachers at Fox Elementary. So we also we have a senior walk, and that's for alumni graduating from high school and college. Then we be walking the halls at Clark Springs. We would like for you to join them from 1:30 to 2:30. I'll put the date there. I'm trying to hurry up. I know that we're going to have a moving on ceremony, which is June the 8th. That's for 5th graders. That will be at Benford at 10 a.m. We also, on May the 19th, excuse me, 4th and 5th grade will have their dance, 5:30 to 7 o'clock p.m. It's free. But one thing, the student must be accompanied by an adult. We're looking for volunteers to pass out pizza and other things that they may have there. We also have field day, June the 6th. That's to be determined what date and what time. We're going to also look at Carver Elementary Day. Same thing, Teachers Appreciation Day, that whole entire week. They're looking for donation, chips, sodas, whatever you can give the teachers, gift certificates. May the 5th is their field day. It's going to be all day. K through 2nd grade will be that morning, 9-11, 3 3rd grade and 5th through 5th grade will be 12 to 2 p.m. We're going to also have a moving on ceremony in June. That's to be determined also the date. April the 21st is going to be the 5th grade transition day at Carver. It's going to be 9:30 to 12:30. They will be for 5th graders who is transitioning over to Albert Hill Middle School. They will have one field trip coming up. Kindergarten, the 1st grade and 2nd grade will be going to the Metro Chesterfield Zoo on May the 4th. In Richmond Alternative School, we're doing a Seniors Day at Dave and Buster's on May the 17th. That's for the 12th graders there from all the comprehensive schools. I think it's about 15 students there. Teachers Appreciation Day is the same thing. If you would like to give something for that week for our teachers, please do so. Just drop it off at the front door, and we'll thank you later, and I will thank you, of course, during one of our school board meetings. And if there's any questions, those are all the second district minutes for our school. Except Maggie Wonka meeting, I'm on that board. That is tomorrow morning at 9, if anybody wants to tune in to that. Are there any questions?
Thank you. And if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question, or throw it in the chat. All right. Well, Mariah, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. We will move on to our next guest presenter. We have Jason May, who has been working around the clock on the budget to bring some updates about where we are right now. Jason is the Director of Budget and Strategic Planning. Thank you for being here today.
Not a problem. Thank you for the invitation. Can everybody hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. I'm going to apologize. I had a little technical difficulty getting on this afternoon, so I apologize for that, and I apologize for not being on camera. But we will try to get through this. As Councilwoman Jordan mentioned, we are in the final stages of our budget creation process. My team starts budget creation process probably back in July. So we've been working on this for about the better part of about 10 months at this point in time. So I wanted to start by kind of walking through some of the bigger items that are in the budget, and then jump into a little bit about the budget process, and then close out with a little bit of information about kind of where the economy is, and just some of the things that we are looking at as far as the city is concerned, to try to get a handle on where the economy is going to be going in the future. So I wanted to start with schools. The budget has $221 million for schools this year. That is an increase of a little over $21 million over the FY23 budgeted amount. In addition to the operating, that's just what we're providing schools for their operations during the year. We also have the $200 million in for new school modernization that will most likely cover the George Wythe High School construction. But in addition to that, we've also have the $15 million in this year to be able to help with the renovations and the rehabilitation of Fox Elementary School. In addition to that, we have $2.5 million in for capital maintenance to be able to make sure that we're taking care of the already existing school buildings and athletic facilities, to be able to keep those up to date as we are replacing some of our older schools. We have about $1.75 million in for the homeless shelter. This is a process that we've been standing up over the past couple of years, and we've moved to a place where instead of being reactive about this and having to go and try to find money, we're budgeting for that to be able to cover that expense in the budget. In addition to that, in the same realm, we have $10 million in affordable housing funding in FY24, but we have $50 million over the 5 years. Now that's going to be bond issuance, and it's going to go to help leverage to be able to bring more affordable housing into the city of Richmond. And we're looking at, above that, we have about $800,000 this year to help with eviction diversion. We have $800,000 additional going to libraries. This will put libraries above what their funding level was pre-pandemic, and it will get us to a place where, and forgive me, it's Broad Rock, East End Library, the main library, and the Ginter Library will all now have Sunday hours as a result of this additional funding. And we'll be able to hopefully provide some additional programming at our libraries as well. For all city staff, we are providing an 8% salary increase in FY24. We have a neighborhoods program that we are starting up. This is going to be a pilot program. I think this will be important to the folks that are on the call. This will be a group of folks that are going to help with some of our district meetings, some of our neighborhood associations, to be able to provide a conduit between the administration, council, and our neighborhoods and civic organizations. We had $7 million in for parks renovations above and beyond just maintenance, but to be able to renovate certain parks within the city. Council has added an additional $1.5 million to that. So we now have $8.5 million going to parks that will go to the Smith Peters Park, to Maymont, to Bird Park. These are going to be doing some really large scale renovations in some of our parks throughout the city. Above and beyond that, we have increased the senior tax relief for FY24. This is a program to be able to lessen the property tax burden on our senior citizens throughout the city. This is in conjunction with moving to a rolling application. Previously, we had an application period that you had to apply to be able to receive this assistance. Now we're going to a rolling application. So we feel like that's going to increase the number of citizens that are applying for that. So we want to make sure that we're meeting that need going into the future. And lastly, I just wanted to hit on a couple of high ticket capital items that we have in the budget. Fire Station 21 is now being scheduled to replace. This will be the second year in a row that we're replacing a full fire station. In the 23 budget, we have Fire Station 12, which is over in Carytown. That is being renovated. You should be seeing some demolition either happening right now or in the very near future, because we're in the process of being able to get that moving. Just for context, Fire Station 12 that's being replaced in Carytown, the last major renovation that was done to that fire station was done back in the early 60s. And they quite literally were removing the hay barn from Fire Station 12 because when it was originally built, it was built with horses that were still dragging, carrying the water down the road to be able to fight the fires. Not only are we doing Fire Station 12, 21, but we're also going to be doing a major renovation and replacement for the first precinct. This is a precinct that is relatively small, needs to have some upfits and needs to have some better technology added to it. So that kind of lays out some of the high level things within the budget. We also have $500,000 to be able to provide some language incentives for our employees so we can meet and be able to speak in the native language with some of our citizens within the city of Richmond. And we also have about $650,000 for our employee tuition and reimbursement program. We're trying to become an employer of choice. We want to work to be able to get employees additional benefits so that we can recruit in this current environment. And that somewhat brings me to the economy that we're working in. I've given a couple of presentations to council over the past year, kind of laying out some of the economic circumstances that we're in at the moment. It has moved from a hiring market to a workers market at the moment. And so it's difficult to be able to recruit. And so we are trying to be able to add some additional incentives to be able to make working for the city of Richmond a better appetite for folks to be able to come and do that. Want to talk a little bit about our budget process, because we get to these last couple of weeks here where we start to work with council, and that gets a lot of profile, and we rightfully so. But my team starts the budget process in July. We start working towards capital in July and August, because capital are, generally speaking, very large ticket items. The capital needs that you have in August are, generally speaking, going to be the same capital needs that you have in April and May. And so we start that process early by going through, looking at our fixed asset sheets, looking at our capital maintenance needs, looking at our capital fleet needs, looking at some of our capital paving and our transportation needs, and be able to kind of walk through that. Also balancing with some investments. Again, we are trying to invest in public safety buildings. We're trying to invest in different assets within the city to be able to meet the citizens where they are, to be able to do that. So we start that process back in July. We work through capital in the months of July and August and even into September. When we get into September and October, we move over to the general fund, into the fiscal plan is what we usually refer to it. This is providing funding for all of the departments within the city, both on the personnel and on the operating side. So we work through that in October and November. In December, we reach out to council to begin getting their priorities, to be able to make sure that we're inclusive of their priorities as we go to produce the budget. And then as we get through the holidays, we start to move to budget creation. This is where we get into how much revenues are we going to have. We don't want to project those revenues out too soon or too late. We're trying to find that Goldilocks spot to be able to see what are the revenues looking like coming in, and then what is the economy looking like, and then trying to make some educated decisions based upon that information to be able to project out what our revenues are going to be for the next year. So that oftentimes puts us into a bit of a conundrum, because I'm quite literally in February of this year, of calendar year 2023, projecting out revenues that the city will not receive until June of 2024. So quite literally 15, 16 months in advance. So that's where we have to make sure that we are following the trends, looking at what the economists are saying out there, looking at what the Fed Reserve is doing with regards to rates and where employment's at. So we try to pull all of that information together to be able to look to be able to see how are we going to be able to project revenues going into the future. Really, when I first started budgets nearly 20 years ago, it was often referred to as budget season because it was something you did for a couple of months. And now 20 years later, it's somewhat as the snake that has eaten itself. We start budgets. We're here in April. We've got a little bit of work left to do to get some text amendments and be able to get to a place where council votes to approve the budget. That most likely will happen the first part of May. My team then will begin to produce the adopted budget book. That will be the final budget book. And then we begin to upload that information into our ERP system. And then by the time we get done with that, folks, we're moving into FY25 budget creation. And so my team starts budgets in July. We usually end them in June when we're uploading the adopted budget into the ERP system so that it can then be expensed and people can start spending the money and people can get paid. So it's a year-long process, and it really quite literally starts and stops right at June and July. And so my team will be finishing up this budget after we get this adopted. We'll be getting it uploaded and get that information conveyed to all of the departments, make sure that everybody has the correct funding and make sure that that is done. And then we will quite literally turn the next day and begin to create next year's budget. I don't want to go too terribly into wonkiness. I can do that, I promise. But if anybody has any particular questions, I'm more than happy to try to answer anything or provide any additional information, but I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak.
Excellent. Jason, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions for Jason about the budget process in general or about specific items? And I do think it's terrific to sort of get reinforced of what that calendar is, because you need to be advocating pretty much almost during the previous budget season for what you want in that next budget. And once it gets into the budget work sessions, we're really just nibbling around the edges. And when the final vote comes up, it's pretty much, there's not a lot of room for a big adjustment. And feel free
for
to
everybody on the call that you can now unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question directly.
Wow, this is such a quiet group. I feel like maybe there's something later in the agenda that folks are holding out for.
Jason, I have a question. This was really helpful and impactful. I have to say sometimes numbers being read off aren't the great. Is there, I'm sure there is like a report that I can read to better understand a little bit more about what you talked about in depth, or just review it?
Yes, sir. So we, for the proposed document, we have a budget and brief document that kind of lays out some of the high-level items that are included in the budget. We're actually in the process of being able to update that to incorporate the amendments that council has completed. Once we get that done, I hope to have that out, Sven, Councilwoman Jordan, hopefully by the end of this month, so that we can get that out to everybody to be able to incorporate that into their council district meetings. That sir, goes into, it does have some numbers, but it speaks a little bit more to some of the genres and some of the things that we're working through. And it's not quite as number intensive, and it gives a little bit more context to it. So we'll make sure to get that out to the councilwoman so that she can send that out to all the members of the meeting today.
Thank you. And for those that didn't notice, Sven did drop the link to the budget in the chat, so you can click on that link and go see the full document as it stands right now. And then any other questions?
This is Jim. I just want to say thanks for that much money for parks. They need the cavalry to come riding in, so thanks.
Absolutely. I think what we saw during COVID, obviously, is how much our outdoor space is important to us. And then things that I'm working on in the amendment process, and which I've been talking about all year, the Richmond Gas Works most recent master plan was from 2005. So I really feel like, given the state of our climate crisis, where we are on rate burden for our utilities and just the shift in market in general towards more electrification. Really would like to see us looking at where are we going into the future? What are the next decades, and how do we get to a more decarbonated economy and city? So that's something I've been working on to try and find funding for without taking away from other important projects. Also fought for a grants position for our new Office of Sustainability. There's so much IRA money, federal money coming out of the recovery for sustainable initiatives. And we want to make sure that we are staffed up to take advantage of that. And the latest communication back from administration is that they will be they are hiring more grant professionals and consolidating the grant services, which I think is definitely the way to go. And that there will be a grants person coming on with that portfolio of sustainability dollars as their main focus, as one of their focus areas. So that was good news. Also was fighting for a circulation and wayfinding study for Broad Street. I think as we see, the implementation of the Pulse, people are just cutting through the neighborhoods. They don't know necessarily how to get where they want to go. Also, there's more traffic because there have been some new developments. And with those new developments, especially when we get to Diamond District being built, City Center being built, we really need to rethink how people are flowing in and out of our city and within our city. So Richmond Connects, I was told by administration, will have funding to help prioritize those neighborhoods directly impacted, north and south of Broad Street. So I'm going to look forward to that work. And then, of course, we're excited about money for Smith Peters Park and the $15 million to make sure that Fox can be rebuilt if there's any gap from insurance or the historic tax credits, et cetera. So I believe we can move off of budget. I did see Delegate Betsy Carr enter, and Delegate Carr, we're so pleased that you could join us. And I think this would be a good time to both say hello and maybe give a call to action for folks to reach out and voice their support for the Senate version of the budget. Thank you.
Councilwoman, you are on mute, and Delegate Carr as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilwoman Jordan. Appreciate that. Yes. People should reach out and do indeed and announce your support of the Senate budget. We appreciate that. And I don't think we'll have anything to talk about until near the end of June. That's what I'm hearing right now.
Got it. And one of the reasons that's so important is because there's a huge divide in the amount of funding for schools,
Right.
whether they adopt the House version or the Senate version. And, for the city,
whether we want to give corporations a big tax break or whether we want to pay for our children to go to school in good schools.
I know we're on the same page. So thank you for being here. And we are going to invite you back to one of our summer meetings so you can give the recap, and we'll hear from some of our other surrounding delegates. But thank you for joining us today.
It's always great to be with you. Excellent.
Well, we are moving right along, and I see that Kevin Vonk, our Director of Planning, has joined us. Kevin, you have the enviable opportunity here to give us an update on the zoning proposal to eliminate parking minimums. And I think for everyone on here, I'm just sensing that you're following this topic. It did pass planning unanimously and is on schedule to be at Monday's council meeting. I haven't heard anything about it being continued from there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? You're good? Okay. I'm going to share my screen if that works. All these platforms, just making sure I got the right ones. All right. Slides up. Yes. Thumbs up. All right. Great. So I'll try and give just an abbreviated presentation of what I presented to the City Planning Commission this past week, and it's talking about ordinance 2023-101, which is repealing off-street parking and loading minimums. All right, so on this, just cut right to what changes are we proposing? Some of the specific details are to eliminate the minimum number of off-street vehicular parking spaces required for all uses in all districts. And also going the same for eliminating the minimum number of off-street vehicular loading spaces required for all uses in all districts. So in essence, it is not getting rid of parking altogether. It is eliminating the minimum number of spaces that a new use or new development will have to provide. We are going to retain requirements for dimensions, paving materials, landscaping, lighting, and buffering from adjacent parcels. So for those who do build parking, you will still be subject to all of those requirements. A lot of this has to do with making sure they're designed in a safe manner, and also buffering from adjacent parcels when you have commercial industrial uses closer to residential ones, making sure that there's space in between those uses, or landscaping to help ease a transition between those. But the proposal on the table would eliminate the minimum number of spaces, both for off-street parking and for loading. And the way that we've been trying to look at this proposal is a parking policy shift. And so our zoning ordinance talks about a few ways of regulating things. And when it comes to your property, there are some things that we require you to do, like you shall do this. There are a number of things that permit you to do something, you may do this. And then other things where we'll prohibit you from doing something, you shall not do this. Right now, when it comes to parking, we're in the stage of require, and that is you shall provide at least X number of spaces based on square footage, type of use, some type of formula, but you shall do that. And what we're looking at is a policy shift to permit. Again, not eliminating parking whatsoever from the community, but permitting you to provide parking. And so allowing you as a property owner to look at the needs of your residents, the needs of your tenants, the needs of your lessees, and looking to see how much parking do you need to provide to service their personal needs, their business needs. And so you may have cases where no parking is provided. You may have cases where a whole lot of parking is provided. But it's moving from that requirement into a permissive state. So why make this change? This was following, I talked at another meeting, we've been discussing 3 large zoning changes, more recently having to do with parking, accessory dwelling units, and short-term rentals. These are all initiated by either planning commission or council resolutions, asking us as the administration and staff to look at proposals and bring forth proposals. And when we talk about making this change, it's, I think, important to kind of put into context, why would we propose something like this? So first off, this helps us implement Richmond 300. And when you talk about our master plan for the city, it talks about a vision, it provides 3 maps, and then it lists a whole bunch of goals, objectives, and strategies. And the 5 goals talk about creating high quality places, providing equitable transportation, helping to create a diverse economy, forwarding more inclusive housing, and making sure we forward a thriving environment. And so as you'll see, we believe that eliminating the minimum number of required parking spaces helps us do such that. And in terms of all of these, touching upon each of them, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail, but this change will help us further our vision, or help us get closer to that vision that's elaborated in Richmond 300. A few other things when it comes to city strategy, how else does this help implement? It helps us further our affordable housing plan. When we talk about the cost of housing and things that we can do to look at any way to help reduce the cost of constructing and owning housing. It furthers RVA Green 2050 Climate Equity Action Plan, especially when we talk about our water and air resources in the city. It helps further our strategic plan for economic development. When we talk about what could you do potentially on a parking lot, especially a surface parking lot in an area that may be located near some other development. And it also helps to further some specific council resolutions put forward by both the mayor and council to support forwarding our equity agenda. Look at how this city bounces back from the pandemic and does so in an equitable manner for all of our residents. It helps further in response to the declaration of an ecological emergency. So doing things, what we can to tackle the climate crisis, and also most recently, doing what we can to help address the housing crisis in the city. And so when we look at these, both strategic plans and resolutions, this for us is a call to look at all alternatives possible and how do we help actually further achieve and move towards responding towards these specific resolutions in terms of dealing with these crises. So specifically, when it comes to parking, some specific benefits just to quickly go through. One is to help reduce costs for residents and businesses. Two is to enable more efficient use of spaces through sharing. Three, to stop requiring spaces that induce driving and add traffic. Four, to stop requiring impervious surfaces that degrade environmental quality and human health. Five, to prioritize the movement of people over vehicles. And then six, to enable higher and better uses on surface parking lots. So I just want to briefly touch on each of these and what does it mean or how might that play out. So how much does a parking space cost? If you look at some of the more suburban areas of our city, a surface parking space may cost somewhere around $10,000. When you get to the core of the city and downtown, generally, you're going to be prompted or more efficient to go into some type of structured parking where you're looking at about $40,000 per space. And so these are, I'll just say, estimated one-time costs. But if you look at many projects are financed, so you would have to add in the cost of financing. And also this does not talk anything about operation and maintenance. So when you look at the cost per space, really per day over the span of 20 years, it is pretty extensive. But upfront, you're going to be looking at anywhere from $10,000 to $40,000 per parking space. So when you're talking about, smaller development projects, especially housing projects, where you may be having, $150,000 or $200,000 worth of cost, these numbers are significant. And so that's when we talk about if there's opportunities to, reduce or not have to provide that parking, especially in developments that are closer, that have pedestrian, bicycle, or transit connections. There's ways to help save on costs that could be passed on to ultimately the end user. All right, using spaces more efficiently. So this is just a hypothetical of a mixed-use neighborhood. Just like we find throughout the second district. And so, you look at different functions on the land. So you've got residential properties, and whether that's a single family home, two-family home, or multifamily dwelling, sales and service establishments, food and beverage establishments, entertainment uses, educational uses. And again, this is just hypothetical, but based on our formulas right now, if you had these types of uses, you could potentially have us requiring you to provide 2,000 spaces to meet each of the minimum parking needs for each independent use within. And so with that, though, if you look at how a city or a neighborhood operates during the day, you'll realize that you really never need all of those spaces at the same time. And so, you may have where I'll say the car goes home to sleep at night in the residential use, most all of those may be needed, in the late or wee hours. But then during the day, as people run errands, go to work, do other things, that demand is less. But then you'll see demand pick up in other areas. And so if you look at the flow of parking throughout a day, rarely, and in fact, in this case, never would you ever need all 2,000 spaces at once. And so by eliminating the need to provide a minimum number of parking spaces, you start to allow sharing. And what that is right now, our uses, when you provide, let's say 100 spots, those 100 spots have to be provided 24/7. Whether you're using them or not, they have to be provided. But if you eliminate a minimum requirement, maybe you'll keep those 100 spots for your residents overnight, but then during the day, maybe you'll decide to lease out 50 to an adjacent business or a school or some other type of entity that could use it. And so you start to enable more efficient uses of the spaces that are built instead of overbuilding spaces that many times go unused. So 3, talking about, how we're in a cycle of creating traffic by the addition of parking spaces. So if you look right now, again, our zoning ordinance requires many properties to provide parking spaces, especially when you talk about residential areas. And so you have this increase, I'll call origin parking spaces, right? Where the car starts off. And so when you provide those parking spaces, you tend to increase vehicle ownership, because if you've got a spot to park, the cost or opportunity to have a vehicle becomes that much more, I'll call it enticing. And so as you provide parking spaces at the origin, you start to see vehicle ownership go up. Then you look at, all right, we also provide or require destinations to provide parking spaces. So educational, retail, commercial, whatever types of uses, we make those entities provide a parking space at the destination. So when you've got a parking space at the origin and a parking space at the destination, the tendency for vehicle trips increases. And there's a lot of research that has been done on this. And there's a study that looked at about a dozen cities, and it looked at the number of spaces per capita or per person that were provided in these dozen cities. And some of the cities, grew in population, some stayed the same. But in all of the cities between 1960 and 2000, the number of parking spaces per person increased. And what happened in all of those cities? The percentage of individuals who used driving as a mode of transportation also increased. And the correlation was pretty tight, almost 0.8 for statistics fans out there. But we see, as you provide the parking spaces, you drive the ownership, you drive the vehicle trips, and then as the trips increase, so does the demand for increasing the number of miles and vehicle lanes, right? A lot of traffic engineers, right? They like to move cars, so you just add more lanes to keep it flowing. Side trade-off of this is that, you see a decrease in pedestrian, bike, and transit trips. And so I think, again, when you look at those areas in the red, going back to this proposal does not stop parking from being provided. People will still provide parking, but we're at least moving away from requiring it to happen and adding to the cycle that helps create traffic in our community. Impervious surfaces, if you want to look at this from an environmental perspective, impervious surface is basically, right, when it rains, the water cannot go into the ground, so it's got to go somewhere else. And transportation related surfaces, and especially parking surfaces, whether they're concrete or asphalt or something compact, have negative impacts on the environment. And so you look at hydrologically when it rains, and then now we're dealing with more intense rain events. So we're going to see an increase in flooding and flash flooding, and how fast it takes or how quickly those floods appear, and then increasing the peak flows in some of our streams. And a physical aspect, we'll also see as those surfaces soak up heat, ambient air temperatures increase. It's been well documented, the urban heat island that we have in our community and how it's inequitably distributed, that certain neighborhoods are much hotter than others in the city. Then you'll have other impacts on the water resources in terms of the temperatures and sediment. From a chemical perspective, when you park a car, all that stuff that drips out and lands on the pavement when it rains, it gets washed into the system. And so you see, a decrease in the water quality, but also in the air quality, but both from, the lack of vegetation, but then also the emissions that come from the vehicles, and all of those adding up or leading up to, some biological impacts, not only in organisms, but in us, in our humans. And you'll see higher incidences of heat stroke and respiratory problems. Richmond is one of the top cities for asthma per capita in the country. And so again, going back to, having us require you to create these impervious surfaces that have all these negative externalities is something that we're seeking to stop. Looking at accessibility, again, you know, when you're required to provide parking, you're taking away space potentially for pedestrians, bicyclists, or those who maybe have mobility challenges. And so sometimes it's difficult to navigate from the public right of way, the sidewalk, or wherever you may be at, to the front door. And so looking at opportunities, if instead of providing a parking space to meet your minimum number, you can now provide a way to get to the front door, or in fact, even move buildings closer to the street, you're helping us to work on accessibility. And then again, talking about the efficient use of space. Our city is locked where it's at, unless Delegate Carr can get a lot of her colleagues to remove a decades-old annexation piece. We are what we are as a city. And so we're trying to figure out ways, how do we have the highest and best use out of our spaces? And so when you look at what else could you do with parking spaces, this estimates the space that 4 parking spaces take up. And so, and they're best if you can get parking right off the right of way. It's only about 480 square feet, 15 feet deep and 8 feet wide. But in many cases, you know, you need a drive aisle and or some way to access these. So you can actually end up almost needing 1,500 square feet in some cases just for 4 parking spaces. And so we talk about that use, and we talk about our need for other things in the city, like housing. You know, this is a spot maybe where you can have an accessory dwelling unit, or this is a spot where you can start to have a townhome, or do other things in terms of providing for our community. So just looking at how you provide that spaces efficiently. So the other thing I think, just to put into context, and I think is appropriate, you know, really for the second district, is, you know, stepping back to look at when Richmond was built. And this map shows the parcels that are shaded in colors from the purple up into the light greens. These show parcels where structures were built before 1943. And that is when the city adopted its first off-street parking requirements. And they only applied to mostly residential uses. We didn't do parking requirements citywide until about 1960. But if you look at the histogram, almost half of our structures were built before 1943, before we had any parking requirements. And I think one of the concerns that has been brought up is like, well, if you don't have parking requirements, people will no longer build parking. And I think if you look at neighborhoods that are in the second district that were built before we had any parking requirements, you'll see a variety. And that is, you'll see structures that built no parking, structures that built some parking, and structures that built a lot of parking. But again, it was based on the use, and it was based on the ability to access other uses and transportation. And so again, without the regulatory environment forcing somebody to provide a parking minimum number of spaces, they were still provided. And so I think what you do is you also had a situation that allowed some of these great neighborhoods to evolve in the way they do, because they did not have to provide all of these spaces dedicated towards parking. They could use them for other great uses like residential and the great restaurants and shops that we enjoy in our neighborhood. So that is my presentation. Again, as Councilmember Jordan shared, this went through Planning Commission and will be at City Council for their consideration on Monday. So thank you for the opportunity to share today.
Thank you so much. And I would like to open it up to those in attendance if they have questions. And I'll just ask, you know, when you unmute, please try and keep the question concise so that everyone has the opportunity to get their question in. And if you would prefer for Sven or myself to read your question, happy for you to put that in the chat and we will keep an eye on it.
Ainsley?
This is Doug, and I was wondering if there was a kind of a quick way to recap what the discussion at the Planning Commission was and why they unanimously supported this concept?
Sure. So there was, I think, a pretty thorough discussion. We did spend quite a bit of time on it, both discussing it among the commission members and also listening to public comment. I think we talked through some of these points that we had here today. I will say from commissioners that I spoke with who maybe had more reservations about this on the front end. I think it was the discussion about the policy shift, and that is, moving from a situation where we require to one that permits. And I think talking about some of the cases, both large and small, but really large scale developments that even though required to provide parking, provided over and above to the tune of 3x the number of spaces that were provided. But also that it is not requiring anyone who has parking right now to do anything differently. I think one of the other parts is the consideration for the ability to now share. And I talked about some large property owners who had large private parking lots and had no interest in sharing. And I think, there's some discussion about, well, as a private property owner, it's my prerogative if I want to share parking or not. But many times, like, I can't even have that conversation because I'm required to provide those minimum number of spaces 24/7. But if that requirement goes away, now I can at least start to have that conversation and provide opportunities for sharing. And I think that was one of the things that if this moves forward, that our office would need to play a role in, and it's just education about the ability to share. Again, I can't make any specific private property owner do that sharing, but I think once they see that, hey, I could monetize or use this underutilized asset, there's great opportunity in that. And then I think the other piece that Councilmember Addison discussed and talked about, and will likely talk about at council, is just also how do we then address on-street parking, and looking at the management of on-street parking throughout the city. And then again, looking at parking, I'll say in whole, and that is both on-street spaces and off-street spaces, and the ability to kind of look at them collectively, and price them appropriately, and look at how you could manage them in the best way possible. So I think that's probably a summary of some of the points that were discussed.
Thanks, Kevin. And we've got Ainsley up, and then Cindy, you're next.
Hey, Kevin. Just want to thank you for the really thorough presentation. I wholeheartedly support removing the parking requirement minimums, as I shared with Catherine and the rest of council in an email. I think you touched on some of the reasons that are really important in terms of being more intentional about our building up our multimodal infrastructure, as well as kind of some implied bias, if you will, that parking minimums imply that people have cars, and not everyone does, and kind of the implications behind that in terms of accessibility to housing, accessibility to more transit options, and not being so dependent on cars. So I just, again, thank you for such a thorough presentation, and have tried to do my due diligence in conveying my support of removing this.
Great. Thank you for your comments.
Cindy?
Hi, Kevin. I also appreciate your comments tonight in your presentation. I've lived in the Fan for over 30 years, and I certainly appreciate that many of your slides pertain to, you've mentioned suburbia, which we are not in our neighborhood. And you have mentioned a lot, and many of the slides focus on the downtown area, which is very different. I am exceedingly concerned that, as proposed, this is far too radical. We do not have a transportation infrastructure in place right now. It actually, to me, seems irresponsible for the city to be doing such a blanket, bold, in one step move. And I think it is going to have a huge negative effect, especially on the fragile historic districts that are throughout our community. I do wonder, how is the outreach for some of these neighborhood associations and places that need their voice heard? How has that outreach happened from the city? Are you able to help with that? And to what extent has the city considered smaller steps, see how it goes, get better infrastructure, and move diligently and progressively, but not in one jumping off a cliff?
Director Vonk, I do believe you are muted, my friend.
Thank you very much. Just want to make sure I cut down on the traffic noise outside. So
Noise pollution, that's right.
yes, right. So just a few of the pieces, in terms of engaging the public. We have been discussing parking as part of 3 zoning changes that have been proposed, as I mentioned, talking about parking with accessory dwelling units and short-term rentals. There are all going to be 3 papers that are considered separately. But because there's some overlap between them, we've talked about them collectively. So we started this process in August, September of 2022. We've had 5 public meetings, both in person and virtual, and we've had over 400 attendees at those meetings. We also had 2 telephone town halls with over 860 attendees. We also tried some focus groups that were focused on each of the particular topics, and we had over 150 people participate in that. 850 responses to 2 online surveys, and then we've done some additional presentations at district and neighborhood association meetings as we've been invited to go to those. So I do believe we've had some pretty robust engagement in terms of reaching out on these. As to
I have attended several of what you have mentioned. I'm specifically curious how you have done outreach if neighborhood associations did not specifically approach you, the 3rd, the 4th, the
Sure.
6th, the 8th, the 9th.
So we sent out early in the process, both for the 3 zoning changes and when this paper was slated to be introduced, we notified everyone that is on our Richmond 300 mailing list, and we notified all of the neighborhood associations. So they all received communication from the information that we have that this was moving forward.
Can staff approach those that you did not hear from? And I'd also love to know what you think about the recent research that was released from the Urban Institute as far as affordable housing and its connection with zoning changes similar to this.
Sure. So in terms of reaching out, we sent out, but we did not personally follow up with every neighborhood association. I think one of the things that we try to do and have been trying to do in our engagement is reach out to the associations, because we think that's a very good way to connect with individuals, but also, through other means, both, and that's why I mentioned the public meetings, the telephone town halls, the surveys, the focus groups, trying to have a variety of information really to get the best engagement we can broadly from the community. And in terms of, I think, the policy shift that you talked about in terms of maybe a more nuanced or balanced approach, I think what we are proposing actually probably is that the city has already reduced and or eliminated requirements in a number of our zoning districts and move those forward. And they've been done in some of the downtown areas, the transit-oriented development areas. So we have done some movement towards that. So this would be another step towards moving that citywide. I think the opposite end, or I'll say a more radical approach, would be to impose parking maximums. Some communities have actually moved to say, instead of requiring you to provide a minimum number of spaces, our approach is to say, all right, we're going to remove that minimum and allow each property to decide. Some have gone so far as to say, well, there's actually a maximum number of parking spaces that you can provide. Some have done so in transit-oriented areas or their downtown areas, really to start to push more forward the provision of parking and the dependence on automobiles. But we are not planning to do that with this paper. This is just simply moving from the requirement to that permission.
And Cindy, unless you have additional questions, that I would also very much encourage you to follow up both with us and with Kevin by email and offline. And I know we're happy to follow up on additional questions, but want to make
I am happy to do that. I do have one more question. How can doing such a blanket approach versus one that does commercial or retail and give those a try before you start looking at residential areas? I just don't understand how the city can feel like they are not losing all of their capability to negotiate with any future developer that comes in wanting to be participating in the day-to-day livability of our wonderful city. It just seems like you are giving away unnecessarily in a one bold stroke the capability to negotiate. Can you talk a little bit about how we have dealt before you came to town and before COVID with the Ascent project, for example? There were a lot of citizens that went down to city council as they voted on that particular project, which is Broad and Lombardy. We were assured it was not housing for students, and we were assured that it would have no negative effect on parking in the neighborhood. It has had a very negative effect on people who are in that particular section of the fan. And actually, the person who said he was offended, we referred to it as student housing. The next morning, his face was the homepage for his development company as having been promoted overnight to vice president of student housing.
I'm going to interject at this point, Cindy. I think it's only fair that we keep going on to other people's questions, and then
That's
we will circle back to this one, because I know everyone is interested in this particular project, but for those who maybe can't stay the whole time, I want to make sure we're being fair and letting them get their questions asked too.
That is fine. I thought I was the only one for questions. Thanks.
And Cindy, just real quick on that question, I'm also happy to follow up separately offline on that.
Thank you. I
Yep,
appreciate
of
your
course.
help.
Thank you. And I think next in line, and thank you all for using that raise your hand feature, we have Martha and then Noah. So Martha, if you
Hi.
unmute, thanks.
Yes, sorry, it took me a minute to unmute. Thank you. And thank you, Director Vonk, for being here. I was listening to the Planning Commission meeting on Monday, and there was one aspect that someone asked a question about parking lots, for instance, in the fan that already exist to serve, for example, the Lee Medical Building, which is now apartments and has a parking lot behind it. I understand that has a parking lot, that parking is required by SUP, so it would not automatically all of a sudden not be required anymore. But it sounded like that developer or that the owner of the Lee Medical Building could just go to the Planning Commission and request an adjustment to their parking requirement and then develop that lot. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, so the elimination of any regulatory framework regarding parking would not impact any special use permit. So if a special use permit exists, it is an ordinance in and of itself, and all the terms and conditions that are in that special use permit apply, including those that apply to parking. So if their special use permit or any special use permit says that this use shall provide X number of spaces, those spaces must be pertained so long as that ordinance is in existence. Whether this particular legislation proposed now happens or not, that individual or any property owner could come at any time to ask amendment of their SUP to say, I'd like to do something else with this. And Planning Commission and ultimately council would make the decision based on how it would not negatively impact the neighborhood or the 6 criteria that are listed out in the special use. So in terms of, I'll say they're perhaps 2 separate pieces, and that is, and to the previous question about negotiation, the city will still have the ability to negotiate and require parking as part of any special use permit. And so if there's a project that is going to come in to the fan and looks to build something above and beyond what is permitted by right, that special use permit parking, if warranted, can be a part of that conversation and those conditions.
And then I don't know how churches work. Do the churches that are in the fan, is their parking required by SUP, or could they just develop their parking lots if they choose? Or could they do that anyway?
I would have to go through on a case by case, depending on when those churches were built and the parking they provided. If they are not governed by an SUP, and let's say, right, if there's an SUP, then that takes precedence. If they are not governed by an SUP and a paper moves forward, an ordinance is adopted to eliminate minimum requirements, they could look at doing something with their parking lots. And I'll say, I don't know what that would be, because I think in terms of the church would have to look at their options or weigh their options in terms of, you know, how many of their patrons, their worshipers park, drive, and do I need to provide that for them when there's services or when there's other events? On the other hand, you know, they may not look at development or taking away those spots, but they may look at additional opportunities for sharing. And maybe there's other businesses or other entities that might need that parking. But that would be something in terms of the property owner would consider. But then again, I'll say all under the context of what the zoning is. And so if the zoning, you know, if they fall into that R6, they're only going to be able to build or develop parking or no parking, what's in the realm of the R6 zoning.
Oh, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks, Kevin. We've got Noah up next and then Alyssa.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Vonk. Thorough presentation as always. You know, this is kind of, I kind of know the answer, but so some of our neighbors who might be particularly concerned about, you know, their on-street parking spaces, for example, being taken up, you know, with the elimination of off-street parking minimums. What are some things that perhaps as a neighborhood association or something, you know, that might be done to mitigate concerns about those on-street spaces outside of the realm of planning and development review?
Sure. I think, and I mentioned this before, one of the challenges we have with parking is that we can require a new development or new use to provide a certain number of spaces. And even right through an SUP, we can condition it and say, you have to provide these spaces. What we don't have the ability to do is dictate where any particular individual parks. And so I think we've seen situations where development will come in and there's a cost to the parking involved and they find parking elsewhere. And so I think I've talked before about trying to maximize, right, the parking triangle. When you look for a place to park, you want somewhere close, you want somewhere cheap, and you want somewhere that's like available, right? It's actually open at the time you're looking for a parking spot. And so I think in some cases, you know, if those individuals are able to find that in an area nearby, there's a trade-off. Or maybe like, look, I know people that park 6 blocks away because they value the cheapness factor, right? They don't want to pay anything, so they'll park further away. I think just what Councilmember Addison talked about, and I've had some discussions with Councilmember Jordan about, is, you know, neighbors gathering together to look at how the residential permit parking works in the city. And so you look at the public right of way, right, as a public asset, you know, and then there's no particular parking spots within, you know, a few exceptions. But how can you look at having that permitting done in a way that provides parking for residents, especially to find ones or look at ways, whether that's through the permitting and or hourly restrictions and or timing restrictions to provide that parking or availability of parking in proximity to where people are living. And so I think that again is one of the probably side considerations. It's beyond zoning in particular, because we're only dealing with the private side. But once the I'll say the market is set in terms of how we're regulating that, those are always conditions that need to be discussed, and I will say as neighborhoods change and evolve, need to be revisited from time to time. And so I think, you know, looking at the parking districts and how those are operated and managed, and I think the other part that maybe plays into that a little bit is that without minimums on the private side, you start to be able to have more crossover between parking on the street and parking off the street. And so there may be opportunities to integrate that all into, again, you know, kind of one asset, the parking spaces, whether they be on our side and the public side or on the private side.
If I can jump in and just add a comment to that, and thank you, Noah, for your question. Just so there's no confusion, the permanent parking districts will remain. This zoning change would not affect that. It has brought up, I think, a need to revisit our permanent parking program, because they're slightly different depending on which neighborhood you're in. And it would be nice to have more, I think, a streamlined process and sort of base level of regulations to it. So in the budget amendment process, I actually have asked for money, and this was something that our friends in the planning department, friends in the parking department really support, and we're hoping will get funded to look at all of our permanent parking programs, and you know, to make sure there are no loopholes also that can be taken advantage of, because it is the tool that we have when neighborhoods, whether it's a commercial neighborhood like Scott's Addition or a residential neighborhood like Carver, that's our tool to try and mitigate any pressures on parking that are exacerbating the neighborhood. Thanks.
Alyssa, we've got you up next, and then Grady.
Thank you very much, Sven. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's the best one that I've heard thus far regarding removing the parking minimums. I had two questions. One kind of jump off of what a previous individual was asking in regards to whether smaller avenues have been looked at instead of going, you know, so drastic with removing all minimums. Is there a way to do this on a smaller scale, or is that not really possible?
Sure. Anything is possible. And ultimately, you know, council will make the final decision on what is passed. I think one of the things that in shaping this, I think there's a few factors. One, you know, the initial resolution that started the process of this ordinance was to look at elimination. And so that is kind of the framework in which we looked at. I think I've talked a little before, we have tried some tweaks in particular districts and or for particular uses in the city. So we've started to work towards those. And then I think there's been met with success. I think from an administration standpoint, some of our internal discussions is, okay, well then if we are to say a certain particular threshold, like what is it or where does it occur? And then, you know, we'll talk about saying, okay, well, maybe it's for only structures or buildings that are proposed over 50,000 square feet. I'm just throwing out a number. And then we, you know, get into these internal debates about, well, what about these types of uses, or what about those types of uses, or these particular cases? And then we, you know, find ourselves getting into something where it's, I'll just say, becomes much more cumbersome. And so I think one of the pieces, and ultimately, you know, we will enforce whatever gets adopted. But adding to some of the previous comments that we talked about, I think the administration and enforcement right now is currently very cumbersome in terms of depending on where you're built and depending on where the requirements. And that's another reason I think to support the wholesale change.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. My other question, I think you've touched on, but I'm really hoping for something very definitive, is what are what protections are in place to keep developers from building large new apartment complexes with inadequate or no parking at all?
So and I'm not trying to be flippant, but I think the lending world. So if the and I'll just talk through. So if the city adopts an ordinance to eliminate minimums, in theory, a developer could come in with a by right project and build 100, 200 units and zero off-street parking spaces. And I say in theory, because one, you would have to get to a spot in our city where the zoning would allow such density. So that's only going to be a handful of our districts and maybe TOD1 or B4. But then they're going to be battling up against a number of forces. The first one is, unless somebody is independently wealthy, most projects are financed. And I have yet to meet a lender, say a liberal lender, who does not think about parking when they're doing their equations. And you can, as we've talked with developers, or even in some cases, asked developers to reduce the amount of parking, think they're overparked, they met us back with like, well, then I can't get the financing. This is what my lender is requiring me to do. I'll think the other piece, and especially maybe when it comes to residential, is just thinking about the end user, the owner, the tenant, whoever's going to be there. Look, I mean, we're very real in that the number of individuals who or households that own a vehicle, the percentage is quite high. Right. I mean, it's not 100%, but it's high in the city, and it's high, in Virginia, and high nationwide. And so when a developer, right, coming in looking to do a project, is looking to make money, they need to think through, could I build this project with no parking, and could I get it to fill up? Maybe you could get a smaller scale project that's located either near the Pulse line or in a very dense mixed use area, and could get a few units. But in terms of being able to build a large structure without any parking whatsoever, I think would be very much infeasible. The part, I think, when I go back to the ability of maybe that development itself does not provide parking, but with the elimination of a minimum and having every single project have to provide its own parking, that 100-unit complex, what they could do is look at sharing. And they could look at sharing with a user that maybe has an office user, right? That uses it during the day, but doesn't use it at night. And so there's more opportunities for partnerships in doing those things. So I will say in terms of the protections, I think there's some built-in economic ones in terms of having that in place, especially for larger scale developments. And then just like the last part of that is, even with the regulations in place, we had 50 large scale, either residential or mixed use projects. We required them to provide like 4,500 spaces, and they provided over 12,000. So just what has happened over the last 5 years is they have provided that and more.
Okay, wonderful. So is it true that if an apartment complex is built within a neighborhood that is part of the Richmond City Parking Program, and the apartment complex does not have any parking provided to its tenants, that those tenants could join the parking program?
To my understanding, yes, that they would be considered a resident of the district and could join the parking program. I think as Ms. Councilmember Jordan talked about, I think that is one thing to have discussion about in terms of how that program is run, or how those things are allocated. But in terms of being a resident of the neighborhood, they would be, depending on where the geographical boundary is drawn.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for your answers. I do think that last point is of some great concern, and also possibly could be a very strong reason that the developer could present to the lender for possible parking for the tenants. So I guess that's something we'll continue to discuss. Thank you again for your time.
And
Thank
that,
you.
Melissa, that's definitely like one of those loopholes that we need to address with or without this resolution, frankly.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alyssa. We've got Grady, Trevor, and then Jerome. So Grady, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. As always, really appreciate being able to hear from you, Councilor Jordan, Sven, Kevin. Appreciate you guys just giving us the space and just hearing us out. So I'm actually here tonight. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Grady Hart. I'm the president of the Rosedale Civic Association on the north side. And I wanted to voice my support for the ordinance. I certainly recognize that folks, particularly in the Fan, Museum District, Carver, might feel pretty strongly about this. But the way that I look at it, anytime that we are using or that we are requiring parking for a piece of land, anytime that we're requiring potentially more parking than is actually necessary, we're eliminating space that could be used for affordable housing, for bike lanes, for sidewalks, for green space, for all sorts of public assets. And especially given that we are now officially in an affordable housing crisis, I think anytime that we are setting aside land and saying that it has to be used for cars, we're doing a disservice to people. We have to stop designing our streets for the benefit of cars to the detriment of people. And so for me, when I think about it this way, it really does seem a little bit short-sighted to continue requiring more parking than necessary. I understand that we need better public transit, that we need more bike lanes, that we need other means to ensure that people have other ways to get here and there. But we need to stop dedicating so much of our infrastructure to cars. And that's especially true of the infrastructure that we're dedicating for them to just sit there, taking up really valuable space that we need for other things. So from that perspective, talking to folks in my community on the north side, what I'm hearing is that we would definitely be supportive of the elimination of parking minimums. And personally, I'm very hopeful that that will get passed. So again, thank you all so much. Appreciate you just creating the space for us here and listening to my comment as well.
Thank you, Grady. If you didn't have any follow-up questions to that or any clarification that you're looking for from Director Vonk or us, then I will move on to Trevor.
Thanks so much. Director Vonk, really appreciate your time, along with you, Sven, and Catherine, for having this meeting tonight. This has been really great. So I come tonight to kind of share the collective thoughts of the Greater Scotts Addition Association. And as someone on this call, and definitely those running this call know, parking has been such a great challenge for our growing neighborhood. We have a lot of different issues, and we're kind of an outlier when it comes to some of the surrounding communities in terms of our mix of live, work, and play type situations, kind of having a mixed use type makeup. But we echo Grady's sentiments in that we broadly support the proposed parking reforms being considered by council here. We only have minor concerns around public safety. Some folks have listed concerns around mainly things that relate to our infrastructure. Having to walk multiple blocks back at night in a neighborhood that doesn't have, in our opinion, adequate lighting, lack of sidewalks, things like that make it a little bit dangerous. So we have heard some resident concerns around that, but overall we are big proponents of this. It's been an issue we've been trying to solve for years, and I think that to Director Vonk's point, I think that this will kind of allow the free market to decide what works, and we'll be able to make it work out. Just the economics will basically work it out in the end. That's our hope anyway. So hopefully this will help solve a pain point. as our neighborhood continues to grow, especially grow up. And I think that, less parking is extra space for things like parks, business, and businesses with limited amounts of space can, expand maybe out onto the sidewalk or into parking spaces, using the Parklet program and things like that. So I think overall, as we find more become more of a multimodal city, this is a good thing. And I think that I can speak for our whole board when I say we applaud council for kind of taking this bold move and bold step. So thanks again for the time, and just want to convey our thoughts.
Thanks, Trevor, and appreciate the association and all the associations that have been discussing this thoroughly over the last 8 months. Jerome, we've got you up next.
Thank you, Director Vaughn and Kevin, and I'm sorry, Councilwoman Jordan. My question is totally different. Is there some sort of proposal to, I guess, support a shared parking process? Because I'm seeing that Lowe's has started to shut down their parking lot, and Kroger will tow you away. And so the question is that if those parking spaces are no longer accessible to places such as the Camel, the Firehouse Theater Project, then those businesses are subject to go out of business because people can't get to them any longer.
Sure. So I think one of the things that our department would work on is, I'll say, some education in terms of if there are no longer minimum requirements in place that would allow or permit, enable owners who have large parking to be able to share. I think we are not in a place or don't have the authority, probably not even through Code of Virginia, to require individuals to share it. I'll say the exception would be, we could do that as a condition through a special use permit. And actually we've done that in a few near the James River to provide access to the James River Park system. We've said, look, you're going to provide off-street parking for residents, and you're going to provide, I think the Falls is an example, 21 spots that the public's going to be able to access. So I think we still retain that ability through the special use permit process. As for those, by right properties, those that, have had parking or continue to have parking, we will not be able to force anybody to share it. But I think it is part of our prerogative that if this moves forward, we would provide some education to let people know that they can. And so hopefully, I think as was mentioned, economic interests would work themselves out in terms of being able to use underutilized assets. But our role would be helping to educate the business community, especially in their ability to have that sharing.
I would like to continue this discussion for a moment. And Jerome, I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, what would it take for the city to more proactively try and create that marketplace for shared parking? Whether we are creating our own parking enterprise where folks that have lots put it into the city's management and we add it to our zone parking, or the metered parking system, or whether we try and really play matchmaker between lots and neighboring businesses, or lots and some of these vendors that have the apps and you can pay for the parking spots. Because I really do feel like with the emphasis that we have on shared parking, regardless of what happens with us, we owe it to our residents to get further along down this path. And other cities, I think, are great examples of prototypes. I heard Cincinnati has a really good system. Last time I went to Charleston, I mean, every surface lot was rented out, regardless of who it owned to. Like, I parked in a church parking lot and it was open for tourists to, pay by the hour. And it was the same app-based program throughout several neighborhoods. So is that something that you guys would prioritize, or is that something that council needs to legislate as a priority and put some funding behind? How can we improve that? Thanks.
Sure. I will push back to council a little bit to take the lead, but I do think to that point is parking is best and most efficiently used when you can look at it as like one asset, right? And so when you look at a space as a space, whether it's on our public street or whether it's in a private lot, a space is generally a space, right? The same size and dimension. And so I think a few alternatives, at its most basic level, part of that education can include having individuals or property owners get themselves on to existing apps. So I think, like Spot Hero is one that I've used, or a number of people use, that it basically, hey, I've got a parking asset. I can set my rates, I can set my times. And it basically allows, a user, when they come in, they see all the available options. They see public options, they see private options, and hey, now I'm part of that mix, and then I can utilize that space. I think the other is, if you look at either one entity or multiple entities, managing both on and off street spaces. And I think the government has capability to do that, whether the city wants to start its own parking enterprise and or contract with a third party to do that. And you'll see, right, in many large cities, SP is active here. They're very active in some other cities, managing both on and off street spaces. And what they're able to do is, not only price them appropriately, but for the user, make it a very, I'll say, seamless experience. Because I think one of the things that we also talk about is, trying to get to a spot where parking is priced in a way that the optimal situation, there's always at least one spot available on the block. Because when you talk about traffic and emissions, I forgot the exact number, but there's a lot of traffic caused by just people circling the block looking for a parking spot. And so if you can get to a way where you create that availability and get, longer term parkers to park in a certain area and save that on-street parking in commercial districts, right, for the tenants, I think there's definitely opportunities to pursue that. And I'm glad to hear that you're talking about, looking at funds for doing, a parking study or enterprise. I think that's definitely something that the city needs to consider. And again, whether the city does it themselves or contract with a third party to do it, I think that's a great way to, again, make it efficient. And for those who, have concerns like, right, I don't have time, right, or the energy to manage like my parking spaces, but hey, I can work with a third party. They'll take a cut of it, but to me, then I still get some revenue that I wasn't experiencing before.
Thank you. Well, you heard it here first, likely legislation coming out of council having to do with citywide parking. Jerome, did you have another question or is your hand
Yes,
raised?
just quickly, if a project is going to come to pass and there's a by right project, but they're not there and they're meeting their lot coverage, what happens if they say that, now that we don't have to provide parking, an SUP would still be required? Is that correct?
So if they're if they're violating any or asking for relief from any provision of the zoning ordinance, yes, they would need either a BZA exception or a special use to get that entitled. So yeah, like lot coverage or height or setbacks, any of those things, they would still need to get relief one of those ways.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Jerome. And I apologize if I botched the pronunciation, but Merrick, I've got your hand up as well.
Cool, great. First, I wanted to echo everyone else's comments about appreciating the opportunity to be able to ask questions and give feedback. And I just wanted to also echo how much I support this, and also, although that sounds like there are some questions, things to be worked through, not letting the perfect be the enemy of great and great opportunity. And just if we wait to find a perfect solution, I feel like we have missed the boat. And just really am looking forward to the positive improvements that this can make to our city, especially looking at some of the environmental impacts and impacts on housing. So once again, just want to really appreciate y'all taking the time and how excited I am about seeing this potentially move forward.
Thank you. And I think we have time. Cindy, you brought up the building that was built in the Lowe's parking lot, and that is something that gets talked about a lot. Kevin, as folks are not really happy with it before my time, and I was working on a different personal project and honestly didn't follow the evolution of it. But how did that project come to be in its current form? I do feel like if people are parking in the neighborhoods, then, I mean, that's something that the parking enforcement should be able to crack down on. And then where there's not a current neighborhood parking program, then we could address it through expanding that boundary or creating a new one. Thanks.
Cindy, if you don't mind, I'll help out with this one because I remember being part of the initial discussion as far as the Ascent program is concerned. Actually, it was called Opus at the time. And so we talked to them about this project over and over again, and we asked them, was 66 parking spaces enough for 333 units? And they kind of said, well, you know, most people will ride bikes and take buses and all this other kind of stuff for the most part. And we said to them that, you know, you're not going to be able to park in Carver. You're not going to be able to park in the Fan because these are parking by permit districts. The problem that we're having, Catherine, is that the parking enforcement people are not up to their game the way they should be because they may be understaffed. And so if those $60 tickets were to hit on a regular basis, it would be a different story. Now, that's why I strongly believe that Lowe's has decided to lock its parking lot, because now they lock it up. They lock their parking lot when they close. They used to did not do that. And that's because of the Ascend apartment complex.
Thank you, Jerome.
So I would add the ripple effect from that one project has been dramatic. And we are talking about implementing a policy that will be very expensive for the city to manage well. Do we have the funds for staffing to do that?
Kevin, do you want to speak to the increase in enforcement? I know the first priority was getting permitting back on track, but I believe you said that code enforcement was next.
Yeah, and so I think in terms of some of the zoning pieces and our property maintenance and code enforcement, you know, are definitely priorities in terms of enforcing some of those things. I also, I think in terms of working with our partners in public works and parking, you know, looking in that, and that's one of the things when we talk about in enforcement and revenue streams and enterprises of having things that can, you know, feed into each other. And I agree that, you know, some pretty rigid enforcement, I think, would go a long way. That, you know, a few days of getting ticket after ticket, or, you know, getting that boot, you know, send that signal that no, I can't park here, that there is a high cost to parking. And so I think part of that has been, and early on came, and then I think through the council members, those continued discussions with Public Works. And I'll say that is happening now, regardless of this paper, and in terms of where individuals are parking, that we need to continue to make sure that enforcement piece stays strong.
Thank you. And then I think my last point I would make, and then appreciate everyone being here, but I do want to start to wind down this meeting, that in addition to, you know, looking at our permanent parking programs, it's been a discussion on council for a while now. The need to look holistically across the city about where should we consider possibly adding other municipal decks so that people come into the city, they park, and then they get around on transit or foot or bike, etc. And that is something that, you know, I think needs to be looked at. If we cannot call out some shared parking agreements with VCU, the state, etc., and other developers, you know, where there might be a lacking area, it's worth considering whether or not the city needs to step up and create that extra deck. So it would be managed by the EDA as the others are, but part of a larger conversation of how we're addressing parking, whatever happens with the minimums. I mean, people are already complaining about traffic and parking. So I see some new messages popping up. Sven, are there any other comments here that we need to address before thanking everyone?
I have not seen any additional questions in the chat. Again, folks, feel free to either raise your hand or unmute yourself if you do have additional questions for Director Vonk before we let him go. And I did see that we had a couple new folks hop on the last couple minutes. So if you haven't had the benefit to hear the presentation so far, or if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to do so at this time before we move on beyond parking minimums.
I think that's the last thing on our agenda, right?
we got some fun second district updates, but
Okay.
but this is the last spicy one, I think.
Okay, then I do think we need to move on because I have to pick up my daughter from something.
Yep.
And always please continue to reach out to us, directly. Happy to continue the conversation outside of this. And it will be up for discussion Monday. I anticipate, should it not be continued because of budget conversations, it would be on the regular agenda for more conversation then. Let me pull my agenda back up here. Okay.
So unless folks have additional questions or comments for Director Vonk, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks for your invitation. Thanks for some great discussion. So have a good evening.
You too.
All right, thank you. So, Sven, what else would you like to convey from this week?
And first of all, I want to convey thank you everybody for being with us this long and for engaging in a really, really good conversation. Second, I want to apologize for being off camera. The whole Zoom like grinds to a halt when I turn my camera on. Maybe that should tell me something about how I look. I don't know. But so I'm trying to spare everybody that. I did want to highlight two things that are going on both within our second district office and at council for folks to be aware of. One is our continued work on bringing back the Urban Forestry Commission. That is something that we've been working on with stakeholders for a long time, and I know a lot of folks have been working on well before us, but we are hoping to bring an updated ordinance to the Governmental Operations Committee here soon, in conjunction with hiring our urban forester and commencing the Urban Forestry Master Plan work. So we're very excited about that. And the second is, and I know that we've heard some on this from some folks even on the call, on Thursday, the Finance Committee is going to be taking up legislation that Councilor Jordan is co-patroning to make our elderly and disabled tax relief program more generous and raise the income thresholds for qualification. So be able to reach more folks with that program. So I want to make sure that that was on folks' radar. But also just wanted to provide an opportunity if folks had any additional questions, comments about this or anything else not on the agenda. And if not, you know where to reach us.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.